As some of you will know, I've recently returned from my annual retreat with my college roommates. And for the last 4 years, we have enjoyed spending time with those at St. Michael's Priory at Willen near Milton Keynes. We normally meet at Willen Lake for a coffee before engaging with our friends at the Priory. This year, as soon as we checked into our rooms, did I realize how tired I was, for tiredness came over me. And in many ways, it was comical. As we arrived for a silent lunch, and my stomach was having no silent lunch at all. Normally, I have the chance to say that my stomach not only lets you know it's hungry, but it also says thank you afterwards when it's been fed. But not this time. I've said this before, how the Baptist Church and other free churches and free church denominations miss out on the events of Holy Week. We seem to go from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday without knowing what actually went on during that week. But I've discovered that as each Baptist church is autonomous, some do remember and celebrate, others not. As for us, maybe we need to reconsider our stance on Holy Week. And yet we've already missed out on the events of Friday and Saturday. John alone tells us of Jesus arriving in Bethany, where Mary Magdalene anoints Jesus with pure nard, and of crowds coming to see him. And so today we arrive at Palm Sunday, where Jesus humbly enters Jerusalem on a donkey, a symbol of peace, and not a horse announcing triumph and war and kingship. All four gospel writers tell us of the triumphal entry, each signifying the importance and relevance of the event as prophesied in the book of Zechariah. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. When those Jesus followers began to untie our donkey Sarai, our young donkey, they acted just like they owned her. They didn't ask permission. They didn't look around to see if it was all right. They just began to untie her. I'd seen these disciples before. Jesus was a popular prophet in those days, and he often stayed in nearby Bethany, just down the road with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Yes, Lazarus, who had been raised from the dead, that Lazarus. I shouted to my father, "Dad, someone's taken our donkey." The old dad popped out of the house like the house was on fire. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" he yelled. They stopped, startled. But my dad didn't stop until he was 3 inches away from the face of one of them. "I asked you a question," he shouted in the man's face. Our master told us it would be all right," he stammered. Jesus," said the other one. "Jesus said to tell you he needs it." My dad suddenly relaxed and stepped back and put his hand out in welcome. "Jesus." A smile flickered across his face. "Your teacher is a great man," Dad said after a moment. "I've listened to him for hours. I love what he says about the kingdom of God being right now." Then Dad began to untie our donkey. "You like this one better," he said. "He's used to people and pretty steady. The other's just a youngster. We haven't broken her in yet. She'd be a bit frisky, I wager." Jesus specified the younger donkey. "Unridden," was the response. "I don't know why." Dad cracked a smile and said, "Sure, whatever you say." He untied the colt and did right. He said, "You did right by coming here. I told Jesus that whatever I own, if he needs it, it's my pleasure." He handed the reins to the disciple. "We'll turn her right away after Jesus is finished," the disciple said. "I'll bring her back myself." Jerusalem, being the city of the great king, the center of Israel's religious and messianic expectations. Now, at this time, Jerusalem had grown from a modest military fortress to a world-class city with a newly renovated temple that rivaled nearly any in the ancient world. Public pools were fed by the Gihon Spring, and 2 aqueducts that brought water to the city from as far as 7 miles away. And what happens next is only recorded in John. For some Greeks sought Jesus. They approached Philip, and Philip went and told Andrew. And they both, Andrew and Philip, went and told Jesus. Luke adds that Jesus weeps over Jerusalem, saying, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes." Although the rejection of Jesus by many of the Jews was predicted in the Old Testament, Jesus still feels great sorrow over their rejection, surely reflecting the heart of God as he contemplates the Jewish people's rejecting his prophets and his son. Now the road turned, and the city walls seemed to rise above us, so we had to look up to see their heights. Jesus signaled to me to wait for a moment, so I stopped Sarai. The crowd somehow sensed a pause, and a hush of awe seemed to overcome them. As I watched Jesus, I began to see tears running down his face and bury themselves in his beard. The teacher was weeping. Jesus was crying. As I listened, I heard him quietly speaking. At first, I thought he was talking to his disciples. Then I realized he was speaking to the city itself, quietly, longingly, tearfully, sadly, personally. Almost like a broken-hearted father might plead with a rebellious child. If you, even you, had known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come when your enemies will build up an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and your children. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. I didn't understand it then. None of us did. But less than 40 years later, the Romans laid siege on the city, pulled it down and destroyed it, just as Jesus had foretold. But I was just a boy, and it seemed like just a party during that buoyant procession down the hill. What did I know? Matthew tells us Jesus returns to Bethany on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. So that was Sunday. On Monday, Jesus curses the fig tree because it bore no fruit, and his anger continues as he enters the temple. I wonder, what was it like? What kind of day have I had? Don't even ask. I mean, it started out fine. Got down to the courtyard, marketplace, nice and early. Beautiful morning. Clear blue skies. And I got a brilliant pitch right by the temple gate. Got my stall set up in time for the early birds. And it was all going fine. Well, you know what it's like. get enough stock, shifted during festival season, and you're set up for the rest of the year. And there I was, minding my own business, doing a nice, steady trade. Then suddenly, there's this almighty commotion. Didn't think much of it at first. Well, you know how some of the youngsters are. Passover always fires them up. Then they start picking an argument with some Roman guard and get themselves arrested. Keep your head down, Simeon, I say to myself. You've got family to look after. Watch your stall and keep out of trouble. Well, I could hear this guy shouting from across the courtyard. Assumed it was one of the Roman officers at first, barking out his orders, giving people what's what. But then I hear what he was saying. My father's house, you've turned it into a den of thieves, built to be a place of prayer, and you've turned it into a bazaar. Well, that's not the sort of thing a Roman guard is going to say. They couldn't care less what we do in the temple courts, so long as we cause no trouble. And then I saw him, Jesus of Nazareth. They say that's his name. And before I could even try to make him see reason, he just picks up my trading table and tips it onto the floor. Well, the lambs went running in one direction, the dove cages shattered on the cobbles, and before I knew it, my whole week's stock had just disappeared. It was all I could do to grab the takings, and half of them went rolling on the floor and got picked up by the beggars. And then he moved on to the next stall, then the next, shouting the same thing. You've turned my father's house into a den of thieves. He even had a go at old Benjamin. I mean, he's worked that pitch for as long as I can remember. And then he was gone. Off to the temple, as bold as brass, and spent the day arguing with the priests and the Pharisees. I'm telling you, that guy is going to get himself into a lot of trouble. He's going to get us all into serious trouble if he carries on like that. All we were doing is trying to make the best of things, trying to make a decent living and give the people a bit of a festival to take their minds off things. We don't want these idealists coming along and upsetting things. And what about me? What's a man going to feed his family with when his main trading stock has been sent flying across the tables? House of prayer indeed. Lovely idea. But that's not going to put bread on the table. Jesus then returns to Bethany with the 12, and that's Monday. On Tuesday, the disciples see the withered fig tree on their return to Jerusalem. In the temple, Jesus is challenged. By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority? He answers with a question. The baptism of John, where did it come from? They decide not to answer and say, we do not know. And he said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. On Wednesday, Jesus continues his teaching in the temple while the Sanhedrin plot to kill Jesus. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas. And they plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. What follows next are preparations for the Passover meal. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover? He said, go into the city and a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. That leads on to Thursday, where they celebrated the Passover and the Last Supper. And we remember at the table Jesus saying that one of them would betray them, would betray him. We know the venue as the upper room. It is here where Jesus washes the disciples' feet and announces of his betrayal. Later that night, in Gethsemane, Jesus prays to his Father. Betrayal and arrest comes possibly after midnight on Friday. And Jesus faces Jewish trials before Annas, then before Caiaphas, and part of the Sanhedrin, and then before the full Sanhedrin, possibly after sunrise. What follows is the Roman trials before Pilate, before Herod, and then before Pilate again, with crucifixion taking place between 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. approximately. But I've raced ahead. I've given you a flavor of that Holy Week. And we have heard how Jesus' ministry was full on, with no or little time out. And we should question ourselves if our Christian lives could be more effective. Are we committed to the task before us of serving our God? Or are we rather dipping our toes into the water? Are we willing to offer more of our lives as a sacrifice in his service? Or do we prefer to remain static, which will eventually lead to stagnation? Today is Palm Sunday, and we normally have palm crosses on the chairs or on the floor. We sing Hosanna and remember Jesus entering Jerusalem with the cheers and laughter, but we all know it will end in tears. As we enter into this Holy Week, may we draw nearer to God and see his heart reaching out to us. May we encounter this week in a fresh way and gain an insight into God's love demonstrated through his one and only Son, Jesus, who died and took our place on the cross. Love came down and dwelt among us. Amen.